I'm so excited. I've been wanting to build a computer forever because my dad builds all of his computers, and so I feel like to truly be his daughter, I have to build my own. My laptop is 6.5 years old and it's not functioning the way that a laptop should function anymore. It's way too freaking slow. It's way too slow. You know your computer's slow when you open up a new tab and the fans kick on. And I'm gonna have a computer after this.
The build will include a Ryzen 7 3700X, 8-core, 16-thread CPU, a 500GB NVMe PCIe 4th Gen SSD, and when Windows is installed on it, my computer will be so fast! A 4TB hard drive, 32 gigs of RAM, NVIDIA GeForce 1660 Ti graphics card, X570 motherboard, 600-watt bronze power supply, RGB fans, and I got an external optical drive just for the vintage flair. And last but not least, a sketchy version of Windows on a flash drive. Initially, my dad wanted to go with me to Fry's to pick out the computer parts in person, but Fry's didn't have anything in stock. But they did have one thing in stock: calendars. I saw this calendar and I couldn't stop laughing at how ridiculous it was. So my dad bought it for me, and it's kind of the greatest thing ever. My best friend and I were inspired to write a song based off of it that will never see the light of day. So, to begin assembling it together, I placed the CPU gently into the motherboard, which was the most satisfying feeling. And spoiler alert, it was the only thing I didn't fuck up on this build. I then took off the mounting brackets for the CPU fan before realizing this fan hooks onto them already attached to the motherboard, so I put them back on. After struggling and struggling and struggling to clip the CPU fan in place,
Okay, I hate this a lot. Ugh.
I looked up a tutorial online, and someone in the comments mentioned they had to use brute force to get the fan to clip in, which goes against every piece of advice ever when you look into how to build a computer. But after trying it, I finally got the fan to clip in.
Brute force, just do it. Oh, I did it!
I hooked up the RGB light cables to the motherboard, and then realized I only needed one of them, so I unseated the other. I snapped the RAM into place, and then got to move on to opening up the chassis to start putting it all in the case. Screwed the motherboard standoffs into place, and then put the motherboard in place. Screwed it in, dropped one screw in the case, which only took like 10 minutes to fish out. No big deal. Put the power supply in place, unscrewed the hard drive mount, then realized this specific one doesn't need to be taken out, so I put it back, placed the hard drive into the tray, screwed it in with the wrong screws that kept falling out, and so then I replaced it with the right screws. Slid that baby in, and then realized that I needed to take it back out in order to plug it in. Learned that I should have plugged in the power cables when the power supply wasn't screwed into place yet, and that I chose the wrong shaped SATA cable for my motherboard setup, so I got to struggle to plug the SATA cable into the power supply all over again with the right cable. Plugged in the power supply for my fans, screwed them in, and then plugged them into the control unit. I gently placed my fancy NVMe SSD into the motherboard and screwed back on the built-in heatsink, since the 4th gen SSDs heat up. Then commenced to plug in all the cables, from the power supply to the motherboard and CPU, and all of the buttons and readers that are on the case. Guys, I was actually really sick when I was filming this, and I guess at some point I just gave up on good camera work. But let's just ignore that. I snapped off the expansion slots for my graphics card, but accidentally took off the wrong ones, so I went back and snapped off a third, and now have an open slot on the top for no reason, since I can't put these back on. Screwed in the graphics card with the wrong screw, then fixed it with the right screw, plugged in the GPU power, and then I was all finished! The moment of truth, plugging in the power supply, turning it on, and nothing. Hours of work while I was sick, and it didn't turn on. Clearly, I gave my computer a virus by working on it while I was sick. It's the only explanation. All I had was some janky-ass nail polish to show for it. I was sick, exhausted, and dejected at this point, so it was definitely time for bed. Day 2. This time, I learned my lesson and took off my nail polish. After chatting with my dad and doing some research, I figured it was probably the power supply that wasn't working. So I was going to go to Fry's and have them test it out. I arrived at Fry's, and the guy working there was nice enough to let me film him as he tested out my power supply. The power supply was completely fine, so it was back to the drawing board. Either the power cables to the motherboard weren't seated properly, or something was just wrong with my motherboard. I reseated the cables, plugged it in again, and nothing. The guy at Fry's told me they would look at my PC and figure out what was wrong with it for $69. But my friend who's working on his PhD in computer science offered to look at it for free. He couldn't figure out what was wrong, and I was not about to give up and let Fry's fix it for me, so I searched the deep, dark web of Reddit. Turns out it's possible I screwed the motherboard in too tight, and the case was shorting it out. So rebuilding the computer outside the case could test if that's the issue. So that's what I did. I took everything out, plugged it in, and still nothing. I was about to give up at this point, until I learned that turning on the power supply isn't enough to get the fans running for this specific build. You have to essentially jumpstart the computer since it's not in the case to turn on with a power button. I tried it, and it finally worked! So then I had to put it all back in the case, and it still turned on. Except the front fans and lights wouldn't turn on, but that was a small issue. Still, meant that I wasn't quite done yet. Ends up there was a cable from the case that I couldn't figure out where to plug it in. After a video chat with Trevor, he helped me figure it out. And the final piece, taking off the plastic, feels so nice. And then I learned that the remote for the fans didn't work, so it took a couple weeks for the company to ship me a new one. But in the meantime, I installed Windows and ended up having some issues. You know the sketchy version of Windows that I had on my flash drive? I bought it discounted on Kinguin, and everything on the internet tells me it's completely legitimate, but I had issues with it anyway and had to call Microsoft to resolve it.
If you're trying to activate Windows 10, press 1. Otherwise, press calling from a smartphone.
Yes.
Good. Should I send you that text message?
Yes. But I got it resolved, and finally, everything was completely done with my first ever build. And it's so sick. I did it! Windows 10 is installed! This is a monumental moment. This is a brand new computer. A blank slate that I can do anything with. I had to rebuild everything like 3 times. But I was successful. I did it. I accomplished it. It's here. This is huge. 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 It's mine, and I built it with these, and this, and this. Thankfully with the help of Trevor, and my dad, and the guy from Fry's. But really, this was all me, and Reddit. So thank you, Reddit. Well, it's so worth it, and I love this case, and oh my god, it looks so good with the plastic off. Oh, it's beautiful. Onwards and upwards from here. Sorry, laptop, you're being replaced, but you've served me well.